Hi everyone, my name's Lauren. I'm just going to introduce myself a bit. I started at Empoword as admin editor, but recently I was promoted to one of the social media managers. Siobhan is the other one, she's here. And also alongside this, I've been heading the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion workshop series. And I'm also joined by April Lloyd, the amazing April. If you'd like to introduce yourself, April, that would be great.
Hi there, my name's April Lloyd. I was one of the first people who helped start Empoword Journalism back in 2020, alongside Lauren and some of the other founders as well. But since then, I became a fellow at Journal Resources, and my main topic of focus has been around disability and also inclusion within the industry. So I'm absolutely delighted to be here. It's one of my passion projects, really. And I happen to be a person on the autistic spectrum with a disability as well. So this is really beneficial for me as well. And I'm looking forward to hearing more and learning more about the industry again.
Fabulous. So today we're also joined by two very special guests, Lydia, Wilkins and Charli, Clement, to talk about the reality of being disabled and or having a learning difficulty in journalism. We're going to be touching on loads of different topics, including tokenism, marginalisation, giving you guys some advice on how to get into the industry as an aspiring journalist. And we're also going to wrap up the workshop by discussing some of their experiences within the publishing world. So I'm going to stop talking, and if you guys could start by introducing yourselves and telling us a bit about your individual journeys into journalism and the other professional spaces that you're working in, that'd be great. If we could start with Lydia. Yeah.
Okay, I was actually going to say, as soon as you finish that, going, Charli, go first, so that I could sort out a vaguely professional response to that. So hi, my name's Lydia. I started as a journalist, I think nearly 5 years ago now. I did my NCTJ. I was part of the Journalism Diversity Fund who funded me. The kind of areas that I cover are sort of disability and social issues. So it can be as varied as, reporting on those who are shielding, such as what I did during the lockdown. Or it can be writing about the dolphins. There was a dolphin project here in Sussex, and there was a campaign to save the dolphins where I live. I also work as a podcast host for Conscious Being. I'm also an ambassador for Accessible, and my book came out on Monday, which was frankly terrifying. Oh, and also it's like April, I'm on the autistic spectrum. We had initially met in, I want to say April 2020, when April found me going, come and talk to Empowered. So it's wonderful to be back.
Charli, if you could go next, that'd be great.
I'm Charli. I'm autistic, dyspraxic, ADHD, and chronically ill. So a lot of my work is about both those individually and about how they cross over. I wouldn't necessarily say I am a journalist. I see kind of writing and being in the media as kind of a part of my wider work. So I kind of say that I'm an activist, writer, speaker, and then I do lived experience consultancy. So I work in the NHS and the third sector on improving psychiatric inpatient care. So I primarily, I guess, part of my kind of specialism is autism in the media, good and bad. So I've written a lot about Heartbreak High. More recently, one of my first ever pieces was about love on the spectrum. And yeah, I guess just kind of whatever I fancy really that comes up. I wrote about ADHD in Love Island earlier this year, which I never thought I would say, but there we go. So yeah, a bit of a mix of stuff. But yeah, I kind of see journalism as part of a wider aspect of my activism, I guess. And I'm writing my debut book as well on autism and chronic illness.
Amazing, thank you. It's so great to have you both here, by the way. I think we should start by discussing diversity because obviously it underpins the whole series. So my first question to you guys is, Do you think industry is doing enough to support and empower those with a disability, creating a space, if at all, for them within journalism, and making adjustments where necessary? I know we've spoken previously, we've mentioned things like tokenism and the tick box approach. It'd be great if you could share some of those experiences, especially because I know that both of you have written bylines for quite well-known big publications like Metro and The Independent. Yeah, so whoever wants to go first, no pressure.
You want me to go first? Yeah, okay. I think it's difficult. I think it's potentially getting mildly better, but I think often big publications see disability issues as niche, so they don't commission them, because they kind of don't see it as like a valued topic that they really need to cover. You know, I love writing for The Unwritten, for example, Rachel's publication, because they are very, very focused on the topics that we know really matter that national publications aren't picking up. And I think there's a lot of trauma mining is the big part of tokenism that I find. My very first article that I ever wrote, I'm someone who shares a lot. I probably share more than I probably should, but they will still come back in the edits and want you to share more, and it's kind of this thing of continually in the edits being like, well, can you give us some more of this and some more of this and some more of this, and it's like, well, actually no, like I've given you what I wanted to tell you. Obviously there are times when they're just asking you to expand so it makes more sense, or that it's got more context, and that's fine, but sometimes it is very specifically wanting more of your trauma to make it a more interesting piece. And I think that's a very hard part of being a marginalized writer, is that you're not really seen as valued in that space unless it's about your trauma, because that's what will go big on social media or whatever on their platforms. You know, they don't want to hear about the average parts or about the stuff that we're really interested in, like autistic joy. Like that's not what they want. They want the sad stuff, they want the inspiration porn, and they want the trauma. So I think that's probably the biggest thing for me that I find really hard.
When it comes to diversity, inclusion, and disability inclusion, in a word, no. The industry is not doing enough by any means. And this kind of, if I say, sort of comes under the topic of kind of the, I guess, a tick box approach, what you might call tokenism. So by that I mean very often publications, I'm very wary of publications that are making all the right noises, because very often in my experience that has not at all been the case. They very often, people have come up to me and like, you know, I freelance for a variety of places, and I'm so sorry, I'm just turning off WhatsApp. Contact of mine has the nickname Lucifer, and it's just come up saying Lucifer's texted me. Sorry about that. So when it comes to sort of tokenism, it's very often sort of, if you're having just one disabled person in a company to cover all disability issues, that is not good enough. It's 2022 and it's time that this, like, frankly, this has got to stop. It's also very often I found that even though I am trained to do my job, I have been a columnist for my local paper, I have done X, Y, Z. Very often when I've been working or wherever I freelance, frankly, it's always kind of like, oh, she's got this disability, so we'll just demote her to like the work that is sort of infantilizing almost. As Charli said, a lot of it is very sort of trauma porn driven. And there's kind of a hypocrisy in that. So, for example, when around the time of when George Floyd was murdered, we were having conversations in newsrooms about how we should not just be commissioning writers of a marginalized background and or of a Black minority background just to write about that. That's trauma porn driven. You should not be doing that. But we have yet to have the conversation about that, about disability. disabled writers can write more than just going, oh, look how shit Pip is, for example. Like, I've had this really terrible experience and I want to talk about it. We are far more trained and far more capable. And yet that's not really happened. In January, I was commissioned to write a profile piece. I won't say who commissioned, what group this was. Organization, sorry. Sometimes I had brain fog due to COVID earlier this year. And it started out well, and they made all the different like inclusion measures and that sort of thing. But it was things like they were texting me at 9 o'clock at night when I had already filed my edits. It's not acceptable, and they would not have done that to any other disabled writer. We are not doing enough. There needs to be further measures. In terms of journalism, we very often hear that newspapers are in fact dying, maybe because they're not reflecting the full diversity of individuals that we cover.
I have one question that's followed up from both of your answers as it goes, Charli and Lydia. You both talked quite substantially about the elements of trauma that can sometimes be associated with reporting on disability, and particularly trauma porn and disability porn. Do you think that in this industry we have a tendency to hyper focus on some of the elements of trauma and disability within? Do you feel like there's a pressure to write almost exclusively about it?
Definitely. So just as a kind of, if I say sort of editorial context, we have the phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, in the sense that in terms of kind of business models and selling newspaper copies, splash the kind of like the most gory, sensationalist headline across your front page. In terms of how the internet and in terms of the models of journalism and all that sort of thing and adapting to the future, you can actually see that that's not necessarily the case anymore. But it's still, in terms of newspapers, that's so very often the rule of thumb in terms of using trauma and sort of it's things like, so we have positive news. Positive news is profitable and it is doing exceptionally well. And yet we're always told like, oh, like there's no like good things to come from journalism. You can't write about the good things. Loving the fact that Charli said about autistic joy, I would absolutely love to see that written about. But it's also in terms of kind of like, when it comes to clickbait, there's always like, oh, like put the most gross, disgusting thing like in there to get as many clicks as possible, just because the internet is so utterly oversaturated.
Yeah, I think disability coverage tends to go one of two ways. It's either the kind of trauma porn side or it's the inspiration porn side. And we don't tend to write the inspiration porn side because we tend to be very against it. But you get a lot of non-disabled journalists who will write like endless pieces about woman with no leg climbs Everest or whatever. Your very stereotypical pieces. And it's kind of like, one, I just don't really believe that there is massive amounts of disabled journalism that non-disabled people should be writing, because so often it's just wrong. Like the language used is wrong. The way they go about it is wrong. It's kind of like talking about, disabled actors playing disabled characters is a similar thing. We're going to do it best. And you're also taking money away from disabled journalists who could do a much better job. And I think that means that you either get this kind of inspiration porn side, and then you get what we're kind of shoehorned into the trauma side. And then I guess your third one is everyone has ADHD now. And everyone's getting autism off TikTok, and like that kind of middle, like non-disabled journalists going on about how horrible it is that everyone is suddenly learning who they are. And there just doesn't seem to be very many nuances and middle grounds to any of that.
I'm loving the fact that you said about autism and TikTok. I think there's also possibly a fourth part to this. I may have had to read there's a guy I was working with. He was a journalistic hero of mine growing up. I may have had to read him the Riot Act recently about how very often stories that deal with disability, it's always like, oh, talk to the parent or the carer and don't talk to the disabled person. I'm loving the fact that April has just put her head in her hands. It's sort of like, yeah, that's how I feel about this. The disabled person is still a person. They have the story. It's frankly inappropriate where other people come into the disabled space and they start to co-opt this. Particularly speaking as an autistic person, the amount of times I've had to deal with parents who kind of like, they co-opt the space where they go, my child is so tragic, they've been diagnosed with autism, pity me. It's not a tragedy, and it's super inappropriate for that to even be said, let alone reported. But there are some circumstances where it's appropriate to go to the parent, particularly like there's stories now where it's like in terms of the cost of living crisis and all that sort of thing. But it would be so very refreshing to actually see disabled people like the front of the story, rather than sort of going, oh, they're so tragic, pity them, or going, oh, hooray, they're so inspirational. We're just human beings. Like, why is it sort of, it's a very extreme dichotomy, and there was so much nuance, and there's so many stories that are missed in this spectrum, to be honest.
I think that was particularly the magic of Rachel's Disabled Britain Daily Mirror series. I got to write as a part of that. I've already mentioned Rachel like twice. We just love Rachel. But that series was so important because everyone involved in it was disabled. Rachel got to edit it. We got to write it. All our sources were disabled. And those were the stories that really mattered to us. Like for me, my piece was about the failures in the education system. And that has mattered to me for my entire life, pretty much. And it was so refreshing to see those pieces. And some of them were so investigative and about true failings of the government. And some of them were, on the other side, talking about disabled TikTokers and the joy of that. And I think the brilliance in that series was the range. And I just love to see more like that, and that to just be a constant.
I'm really pleased actually that you mentioned Rachel there, in particular with that series about the Mirror's Disabled Britain, as there was just so much. I actually really looked at when I found out that the Mirror were hosting that sort of that series around disability. I was quite worried. I won't lie, because from my personal experience within the industry, sometimes there is a tendency to sort of infantilize disability. And so reading how Rachel is a disabled journalist herself, and looking at how that's she had that platform to be able to talk about disability to so many people, it was really strong. I really, really enjoyed that. So I'm glad that you've mentioned that. I actually have another question here, and it's a little bit regarding one of the main questions we often get when we're going into journalism is this idea of imposter syndrome. And I think this is something that tends to hit disabled journalists a little harder. If you've got any advice about how to overcome imposter syndrome or how to work through it, are you able to share it with us?
I think so. I guess so. For me, the biggest example of this is I had a piece killed in January this year, and looking back, I probably should have pushed back more about how they were dealing with me. I think it could have been a more adapted process. I'd never worked with them before, and because they were quite big, I was a bit scared and just wanted it to all go well, and they killed it in the end because they just decided I wasn't doing what they wanted. And I did not pitch a piece for, I think it was like 6 months. Like I just couldn't do it. Like I just couldn't get there. I did get a kill fee. Yeah, I got a kill fee. It was already in the contract for the piece, fortunately. Didn't get it for about 4 months, but we got it in the end. But no, so I just couldn't do anything for like 6 months. And eventually what broke me out is somebody commissioned me directly. So I I didn't pitch it, it just came to me. I wrote that and then I felt a lot better from there. But it was rough. Like, there was stuff that I wanted to write and I just couldn't get there. I couldn't get through it. And I think for me, that is the thing, is I just gave it the time that it needed to settle down, and like just remembered how many other people have trusted me to write and enjoyed what I've written, the impact that it's had. And yeah, and I think sometimes when we write for like big companies, big organizations, if something like that happens, it can be such a knock because you perceive them as so much bigger than any of these like smaller bylines you might have, so it feels like an even bigger failure. But like realistically, it's not. Like, it's just about which editor you land with and whether they get on with you. Like, and it still matters when you're writing for smaller publications, because actually that can have more impact because they might have a more loyal readership, or it might be that they have a primarily disabled readership, so it's going to resonate more. And I think what I've tried to learn is to not see the big ones as like inherently better. But yeah, I think I don't have mass amounts of advice for it because it's really hard, but I just kind of give it the time, settle down, write some stuff without trying to pitch it, like just sit and write my own stuff for a bit, and kind of go from there.
This is a question that's really interesting, only because I've had to think about this a lot recently. So in terms of imposter syndrome, there's sort of, if I say kind of two threads to this. One, I had major imposter syndrome over my book coming out. I was very anxious, and sort of for about 2 weeks, I was basically just sort of holed up in my flat, sort of not talking to anyone, very quiet. You can't really see it, but I was sort of kind of like, when I am particularly anxious, I'm very much a nail biter. Like, it was bad. Like, the sort of visibility in my hands would tell the whole story. And that was partly because due to individuals throughout the whole process of writing had not exactly been kind about it. Partly because I'm autistic, and sort of like, she's a journalist, it's so rare in this industry, we must make fun of her because it's just so new, type thing. And sort of like, in a way, there were people who were sending me quite sort of disgusting emails and messages and things over it, despite the fact that they had not actually read the book. There was it was not particularly pleasant. And it was one of those things, it really did knock my self-confidence, to be totally honest. I haven't really, journalistically, I've not written a lot this year. I've been sick for a large part of it as well. So the thing about this was, a friend of mine took me out to lunch because she knew that I was not in a particularly great place, shall we say. And she just wanted to talk to me. And she said this thing where she goes, you need to remember that you're not going to please everyone. The only person that you need to please is yourself at the end of the day. And sort of, it was kind of, since then, what I would do on at least once a month, I don't know, maybe every 2 weeks, what I would do is I would take myself out for lunch on a Saturday, sit there and have my notebook open and just allow myself the time to spend, like actually in touch with my own thoughts, rather than actually sort of, always being like between assignments and thinking about other things, just in the sense of sort of reprogramming and sort of thinking, actually, this is what I want to do. I'm not going to let other people tell me what I should be doing. It's also in the terms of the language, in how we talk to ourselves. The amount of disabled individuals that I know that they are overly critical about themselves, not because they're being internally ableist, but because in the sense of how many messages we get very often from society and other individuals. A few years ago, I promise this is relevant. I attended a show by the illusionist Darren Brown, and he had this thing where he said, in terms of if you want to accomplish something, all you need to do is change the story you're telling yourself. So if you actually speak it out loud, then you can, in terms of what's going on up here, it can be a really quite useful tactic. the language that we use in terms of how we speak about ourselves is so very interesting. In terms of being kinder to myself, I started sort of, it sounds completely ridiculous, but kind of like speaking out loud to myself, going, actually, you're doing just fine. And if people don't like the book, that's on them. It's not on me.
Yeah, I think that's a really great positive mindset to have, because like you're saying, the imposter syndrome is probably something that is obviously influenced by outside and external opinions, but at the end of the day, you just need to kind of center yourself, like you were saying, and that's great advice. Moving on to like the more positive mindset, I know you guys contribute so much to creating that positive culture for those with a disability. Lydia's like, no, don't look at me. You know, like Lydia with your Disabled Debrief podcast and being an ambassador for Accessible, and Charli's role as a lived experience consultant at the British Institute of Human Rights. And I was just like, you know, I want to ask you, why is this advocacy so important, and what do you both kind of aim to achieve through doing so? Boost your ego a bit, Lydia. I know you hate it.
I have, if I say, sort of conflicting thoughts about this, only just because I sort of, if I say I view myself as a journalist, I wouldn't really view myself as an advocate, only because every single disabled person is different. And this was sort of informed by experiences where individuals online would contact me and would sort of be like, have this sort of blanket all approach. I think then that's not helpful at all. It's not healthy, but I don't want to knock the work of people who call themselves advocates. People like Rachel Charlton Daly, she is an absolute legend to us, for example. I consider myself very lucky to know her. In terms of I think it's important that we are representative of this particular demographic. In the sense of sort of, I'm very aware that I have a sort of privileged position, in the sense that I, as an autistic person, even though I may script a lot, and though talking can sometimes be quite difficult for me, I'm in a sort of a better suited, than other individuals. It's incumbent on us to do better. It shouldn't have to be that way. But it just, in the sense of sort of like, there is a power in writing, in documenting, in posting, in putting things online, even if it doesn't catch that much attention, even if just one person is reading that or just sharing, there is a power in that, and it is a privilege. It is an honor to be in this industry, and I think so many people forget that.
Yeah, I think so. I kind of use activist as a catch-all, because I think it's become a very heavy loaded word, and I'm trying to take that away from it, and it's just a descriptive term about the fact that I kind of work within this kind of area in this sector. But I think for me, the advocacy work that I do in terms of lived experience consultancy, that is it's a product of what I've been through, you know, working within the psychiatric inpatient system, because it's the system that traumatized me, it's the system that harmed me so much, and I work in improving it on a human rights level, on a sensory level, and I work on admission avoidance as well, so stopping autistic people from entering those spaces at all. And yeah, it's definitely a product of that's somewhere that harmed me so much, and so now I'm trying to do what I can to fix it, and it is a horrible system. You know, it's not going anywhere anytime soon, unfortunately, as much as I would tear most of it down, but doing what I can to improve what is there currently, and making staff more informed, and all of that is kind of those culture changes that you hope will happen. And I think it's very difficult, because sometimes my advocacy in that sense feels very separate to my content creation or my writing or my speaking, and I'm trying to do more of bringing those two sides together, because it's very hard. I think, you know, if I started pitching about psychiatric systems, we would fall back into the trauma mining part, so it's very difficult. But yeah, I think it's just about all of my work comes together somehow, like it all links together somehow. But I yeah, it's just about, it's kind of come from necessity. It's come from being harmed and still being harmed, and like trying to combat that, I guess.
I think that's a really sort of powerful ammunition, what you've just described there. It shouldn't, if I how am I going to put this? As a caveat, we should not be expecting people to use their experience to sort of fuel them, but there is something really quite powerful in that.
Sometimes, something I've said a few times elsewhere is like, not every marginalized person should have to be an activist. So part of why I do what I do is so that other disabled people can just be disabled people. You know, for me, it is very much a big part of my life, and it's what I want to do. But part of why I do it is so that others don't have to, because I think that's very much expected. And I think, Lydia, what you were saying before about like George Floyd and Black people being brought on board only to write about anything else, you know, music, film, TV, whatever. I think it's a very similar thing. It's like this thing of, I do it so that others just don't and can just be.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And I think one of the questions that's just popped into my head as you've been talking about some of the struggles that you've had within the industry, as well as some of the times where you've been helped out, is I get the feeling a lot of journalists, both disabled and non-disabled, but namely those with disabilities, have to feel like they've got to constantly push through illness, constantly produce. And sometimes that means that the industry isn't as accessible as it could be. So I'm wondering, how can our industry help accommodate people with disabilities? Can things like newsrooms be adapted? Can we have different ways of telling stories, perhaps?
First of all, news organizations need to be aware of their Equality Act obligations. I will, until the day I die, I will be continuing screaming this from the rooftops. It's sort of like, I have only had, I think, one interview where I've actually been given the adjustments that I've actually asked for out of all the job interviews that I've ever done, which was that's shocking, really. I mean, sort of, I may have only been trained for nearly 5 years now, but I've done several interviews along the way to actually sort of try and get a foot in the door. And it also needs to be, in terms of adapting job interviews as well. There was an organization where all of us were interviewed all together as part of the mock news conference. Now, the thing is, they actually had another autistic person there. And as soon as I met this person, I knew immediately, without anything even going further, that I'd lost out, that I would not get this, just because there is a measurable bias in employment. And I'm very happy to provide details about this, but I knew instantly in terms of the tick box, because it just sort of like, and knew immediately. It's also the kind of like ingrained attitudes in newspapers, newsrooms, and training facilities. I was at an event recently where there was a lecturer, and she said this. I was really shocked by it, and I feel ashamed that I didn't say anything, just because it really took me back. Where she said she had a student who had Tourette's, who had this fantastic scream as a tick, which was red flag number one. And then she said this thing going, oh, poor girl, I wonder how she lives her life. Like, how does she go to the cinema when she's screaming like that, like in terms of her ticking? I'm not being funny, but that's just sort of, that's really indicative of all the attitudes. It's sort of disabled people. It's like the tweet that always pops up every now and again. Disabled people are not werewolves. We are, like, you know, actual human beings, rather than just sort of expecting us to have like this teeny tiny existence. We need to adapt the kind of, if I say, rules around content and what we write, so we're not just commissioning trauma porn. And we need to just, like, frankly, the phrase I keep coming back to is, frankly, don't be a dick about things. It's a very good rule of thumb, but a lot of individuals would benefit from being reminded of that. Just don't be a dick.
Yeah, I think for me, there's a few things. I think one is like flexing deadlines. I mean, obviously sometimes stuff is urgent and that's, you know, just how it is. But I think when it's just like a feature on something not timely, I think there's so much room for being more flexible than people are. I've definitely been up far too late, like trying to cram stuff because I've been ill or like my chronic fatigue has been playing up, so then I have to cram it in at the end. And you know, it would make a better piece for them anyway. So it shouldn't be a problem. I also think just being more patient and more adaptive. So when things like edits, like if I'm not understanding what you're trying to get at, find another way to explain it. Like it shouldn't be making you really frustrated or make you abandon the piece altogether. It should be, okay, let's find a way so that you understand what I'm trying to say here. And the same thing with like forms, like as an ADHD dyspraxic, forms are not ideal. And there's especially like some of the American ones are really hard. And I've never had any support with that. Like it's kind of just, if you can't fill in the form, then you're not going to get paid. And I've always had to like go to like my mom or somebody to be like, I don't understand the form. So I think there's that as well. Just as an industry, it's just not a patient industry. Like and some of it has to be fast, but a lot of it really doesn't. And I think there's like it's like that thing where people they like to look busy, and I think the whole industry is kind of like that. Like it just wants to keep going and keep rolling, and they don't want to be the person that has to stop and slow down for you, but actually that is what we need sometimes. And I also think my last point on this is the expectation of making phone calls. I can't do phone calls. I hate phone calls. I really struggle with them, but there's some times where it's just absolutely expected, and I really have to, like, I spend literal hours just sat like terrified to do it. And it could be an email. It could 90% of the time it could be an email. So yeah, that's
I'm really
things.
glad. I'm really glad that somebody has finally said about the dreaded making phone calls. It's because of the fact that I can't see someone's face. It is absolutely terrifying doing this. In terms of, I really struggle initiating phone calls. It takes a lot. So it's things like people say that I'm a proper journalist, and yet a proper journalist is somebody who is, in terms of the standard, is usually expected to make a phone call just like that. And I get so much rubbish because apparently it's a product of my generation. It's actually my disability that is the issue here. So it's things like, I actually worked out, there was somebody who I had to phone last year. I actually timed it. It took me 4.5 hours to be able to do that because I was absolutely terrified of this person. And it was even, it's one of the tactics I was taught was to write out kind of a conversational script. So in terms of the scripting that autistic individuals may be doing up here and actually writing it out. The only thing is about that particular person is somebody I actually ended up working quite closely with for just over a year. And they thought it was the funniest thing because one of the tactics to get people to talk to you is to compliment them. People love compliments and they will be far more open. So they found it really funny because they asked to be shown a version of the script that I had. So in block capital letters, it just said compliment, insert here. It worked, but just phone calls are bloody terrifying if you're on the spectrum. And I wish so many more people would understand why and stop that expectation.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think leading on from that and navigating those kind of instances, like making phone calls or other things within journalism, do you guys have any tips you'd offer to aspiring journalists in navigating the industry, wanting to make their own impact and putting themselves out there and not being put off, basically?
I think my main one is being very clear on your boundaries. in various senses, in senses like I am not going to make a phone call, or if I do, there's going to be XYZ boundary or XYZ thing put in place. I will write about this, but I won't write about that. And like anything like that, just being very clear on it, because I think when I started making very tiny steps into the industry, I had no idea about any of that. And I really just thought, like, this is my, you know, for me, like being commissioned by the Metro as my first byline was like this massive thing. And I was like, that means I can't say no to anything, because, you know, it's such a big deal. It's such a big opportunity. And had I had my boundaries straight from the start, there are certain things that wouldn't have made it into that piece or further pieces in the year that followed, compared to this year, where I've been much more clearer on that sort of boundary. And also, like, it's really hard because there's a lot of publications that just still don't pay very well for how massive they are. And I guess it's understanding it within yourself what you will compromise. It's like, do you want that bigger byline, but you get paid less, especially if it's something trauma related? Because it is tough to give out all your trauma for not very much money, is not always ideal. And, you know, it's, yeah, I think for me, the boundaries is a big thing, like really being very clear on you and yourself, and not letting people try and manipulate those for the sake of a piece. Like, I think that's probably the biggest one. And I think, like, just knowing how to pitch and stuff is something that I did not really know. Like, I made it up as I went along, but actually there's so many resources out there about that. Like journal resources, for example, are great for like telling you exactly how to do these things. And you can learn all of that before you start doing it, so that you don't get endless rejections purely on the basis that you've never done it before. Yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
On the topic of trauma porn, Journal Resources actually has a really great piece about this by Charlotte Colombo. And in the piece, she recommends taking a kind of like an audit of your ideas and stopping for a second and thinking about other ideas in terms of disability, trauma, or whatever, and pitching those, rather than sort of pitching, you know, comment and all that sort of thing about quite deeply traumatic experiences. I think there's an expectation, and this has become quite loaded, where people go very often. I still remember being advised as a trainee going, write about your autism, it's a great way to get a foot in the door. Frankly, I wish I hadn't done that, simply because the internet is forever. People can, you know, go away and read it. People still, if people find out, it's sometimes they use it as a way to sort of weaponize and to be manipulative. In terms of advice, I really feel like I'm not the best person to ask. So these are sort of lessons that I've learned. You can say no to things, and the power of the word no is really quite something. And the best advice I was ever given was to use that strategically. The second piece of advice I was given was to know your values. So even if it loses you a job or a commission, it's always better to stick with the values rather than, you know, going along and doing something that you know, would not want to be doing. And the third piece of advice is, this actually came from a professor of journalism who's just actually retired. It's about, at the end of the day, if you can still sleep well at night, and if you can actually look yourself in the eye, then you've done pretty good. And by that he means you are answerable to yourself and only yourself. You are not answerable to anyone else, not really, at the end of this. In terms of pitching, I do run over on Substack pitching masterclasses once a month. But as long as you're putting, like, you know, freelance pitch, and you actually have an idea rather than going, oh, I want to write about lifestyle, you can't go wrong with that, as long as you actually have an idea. But just sort of, rather than sort of saying like, I want to write about lifestyle, actually have an idea. I don't know, it could be something like 4 millennial women on such and such a condition as a result of COVID-19. Here's what they would say.
That's really interesting that you've mentioned that idea about sort of feeling like you've got to write almost exclusively about individual conditions, and that what sort of problems that can lead to. And it actually made me think a little bit about how we gain contacts within the industry. And what I want to ask both of you, Charli and Lydia, is for disabled journalists, how can you build up that portfolio of contacts that people need? Do you have any advice on that?
If you don't ask, you don't get. So, and by that I mean, when I was at college, I had started writing for my local paper as a columnist, and I was also interviewing individuals online as part of my now defunct blog. People were always really shocked because I was interviewing people like the singer Anastasia or Jodie Picoult or Jacqueline Wilson. In terms of networking, just ask. It's people can sometimes frankly be a dick about things. It's sort of, if you just go up to somebody at an event and just say, oh, I really liked your piece, and they're just being, bit sort of like offish about that, that's on them, it's not on you. I think very often that we internalize a lot of things that are not actually to do with us. Business cards are a must. People remember you for a business card. If you're looking to do interviews with individuals, most details to contact someone are available online. You just have to keep looking. So if I say a famous person, you're looking for their management. It can be on the about page or their Facebook page. It can be pretty much anything. All you just need to do is to keep looking.
Yeah, I think for me, there's kind of two. So I get Journal Resources emails and I get Sean Meads Williams emails, so that you get kind of some of the current pitch calls, because I think there's that kind of split between editors who are absolutely looking right now for one specific thing, and then also the editors who will just take anything as it comes. So it's not great advice for this moment, because I get most of it off Twitter, and obviously that is rapidly declining. Thank you, Elon Musk. As an autistic, I do not claim him. Anyway, but yeah, Twitter has been great for it, and I imagine it probably will continue for a while. But I just follow like a lot of like editors over there, and I have Journal Resources on notifications, so when they retweet a pitch call, I get it. There's also I'd have to find the app, but it's like Disabled Writers. It might literally just be Disabled Writers, but they retweet like a lot of pitch calls, and a lot of them are specifically disability related, so they are also really super useful. I think it's just, yeah, like I bookmark a lot of on this or that. I really need to transfer them like over to like a Notion or something. So that's probably what I'd say, is don't do what I do and just leave them all in your Twitter bookmarks just to be defunct. Like actually put them somewhere useful for you. But yeah, I guess for me, that's how I've like mostly done it, is just kind of like looking around and seeing what people are interested in. But one of the things I hate most about the industry is how secretive it can be. Like there'll be editors who will be like, oh, I'm commissioning, but they won't put their email, and their email's not in their bio, and then it's not on the website, and it's like this very secretive, you've got to try and search for it. It's very difficult, but yeah.
I have a trick for finding someone's email address. So there's two things to this. So Jen Collins put in a presentation, I cannot remember this website, but it is a way to find. I'm loving the fact that April's gesturing at this. There is a website where you can put someone's name in and it comes up with their email address.
I'm trying to find this now as well.
There's also in terms of, it's sometimes about working out the email formula of the editor. So very often an organization always has the same sort of email because it's based on the same email server. So one of the ways in which a lot of my contacts that I have found since I went freelance is, so if you go on the about page of a newspaper, it will very often show like, you know, where it says like for complaints and inquiries or for subscriptions and issues like that. So that will give you the last part of the email address where it would say like, I don't know, at thesundaytimes.co.uk. And then it's just a matter of working out the relevant editor. So very often it's first name dot surname. You just need to find the relevant editor. Sometimes it can be worth trying to predict the email address. A lot of the people that still commission me now are because I found them through that. They might not necessarily put it on Twitter, but that might be to, like, you know, not get bombarded with pictures. It can be really worthwhile just having a look and trying to generate this. Loving the fact that April has found the website I was thinking about. It's called hunter.io. It's really useful for finding emails.
One other thing I'd say as well is like sometimes an editor will reject one pitch, but they'll give you really nice feedback, and that you like, I'm like, internalize it. Like when you're thinking of a new pitch, then be like, I go back to that person because in that email they said like keep pitching to me because you've got really solid ideas or whatever they've said. Like I recently had one rejected where they were like, we're not going to take this because we're not covering the TV show that it was about, but keep like, we've read some of your other stuff and like keep pitching to us. So like building up those connections is great. Like sometimes you will have pitches that just don't find a place, but it might mean that they'll take your next one.
It's one of the best things I've ever seen, frankly, is the Ellie Middleton tweeted about having what she called a dopamine folder on her phone. So take a screenshot of any compliment, such as what Charli has just described, and keep it in a particular folder so that you can go back when you're having a bit of a down day. Sometimes this could be potentially controversial, what I'm about to say, but it has worked for me on occasion. If an editor rejects an idea and they say why, if it's like because of the angle or something like that, sometimes it's worth replying to a rejection going, okay, would you still commission the idea if we did such and such an angle instead? I've had a lot of commissions just by changing the one idea, by being willing to be able to engage with the editor. It's always worthwhile just sort of going backwards and sort of thinking, how can we do this differently?
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, kind of using that feedback to your advantage and still getting commission out of it. I'm just a bit wary of time. We have about 5 minutes left. It's been great, but I did want to like wrap it up talking about your books, because coincidentally you're both of the same publisher, which is fantastic. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly talk to you guys about writing and publishing your books and how your experience has been throughout the process. And I know we were talking earlier about Rachel, was it her thing on the Mirror? She had so many people involved who were all disabled and she edited it. And I know that Lydia, you've had Emily from 21 and Sensory illustrating your book and the importance of that during the process. And also, if anyone has any questions, pop them in the chat, because we're a bit wary of time. We'll try and get to them, but yeah.
Over to you, Charli. You can go first on this.
I can go first, that's fine. Yeah, so my book, my deadline to finish it is in January. It was meant to be December, but because of my university kind of terms, we've pushed it back the tiniest bit. Doesn't really matter because she wouldn't have been looking at it over Christmas anyway, so it's all good. But I have really enjoyed the process. It's a publisher that's very inclusive. They've worked really well with me on things that I was struggling with as a disabled writer. You know, they brought me on to write about autism and chronic illness, so it'd be very ironic if they didn't adjust to my autism and my chronic illness. I think one of the things I will say is I wish I'd got an agent beforehand, because I think that would have made the process at the start a lot better for me to navigate. Navigating on my own probably wasn't the best move, and I think my intention is to get an agent before I try and write another book. But I think in general it's been a really interesting process. I've learned a lot of myself. And what I primarily use is I use this for my uni essays as well. I think this is it's the best program going. I use Pacemaker Planner. So you just put in the amount of words, how long you've got, and it tells you how many words you need to write a day to do it in time. And I never write that exact amount of words each day, but what it means is that if I do have a couple of days of not writing, I can still put it back in and it will kind of say, okay, now you've got a bit like 20 more words a day. But it means that I don't catastrophize, because instead of being like, I still got 40,000 words to write, it can like 500 words a day. And suddenly that feels far more manageable. So I think that's like the number one tool that I use. And I use it at uni as well. I think it's brilliant. So that's a good one for anyone, I think.
Lydia, oh, sorry.
When it came to writing my book, I have very sort of conflicted feelings over this. So that sort of began as a sort of and it's ended up being an 80,000 word diatribe about how terrible the personal independence payment service is in the UK, basically. I wish that I had been far more organized throughout the process. So in terms of, I was interviewing individuals and taking their recipe, but it was sort of like there was a lot to contend with throughout. I was also sick for part of last year, and it ended up, so from the end of September last year into December the 16th, I wrote over half the book. I would not recommend doing 40,000 words on top of everything else. Like, it was bad, and it was frankly spectacularly stupid to do something like that. I would not recommend it. And in terms of, I was struggling last year with my executive functioning, and a relative of mine died. It's been really nice though, because everyone's been like really nice about it. Just having actually sort of become like an actual tangible thing. I, for a very long time, was thinking this will never happen because we're in lockdown and it seems like this is just going to go on and on and on. In terms of what Charli was saying about an agent, I would recommend the Society of Authors, because they do contract vetting and things like that. They also have advice. Sorry, it's just while I'm talking to you, I'm trying to read the comments, the comment section as well. It's been really nice, but I will never do 80,000 words again, just because it was a bit nuts to do that in 10 months flat on top of everything else. In terms of adapting, I think it's vital that if you freelance, or if there's any kind of element of freelancing in terms of your work, that you have a nice setup where you like to write. It took me ages to do that, and frankly, I wish I'd done it sooner.
Yeah, that's some great advice. Thank you very much. It's 2:00 now, which is so unfortunate because it's been great. But yeah, thank you both for coming on. It's been amazing. Really informative hour actually, and it felt like just like a chat, which was fab. So yeah, thank you again, and I hope everyone's had a good time. I'll email everyone over the recording, and yeah, thank you again. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for your
Thank you
time,
so much.
and hopefully we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, take care.